Thank you all. Thank you to our first panel. That was really stunning. Learned a lot, and I feel that a lot of our questions just are kind of building on that, especially with the historical context and the many places we could begin what one might call the Iraq Wars rather than the Iraq War. So I'm Lydia Walker. I'm assistant professor and Myers Chair in Global Military History in the Department of History here at Ohio State, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. So from the far that side, because I'm thinking stage right, stage left, which is mine, which is the audience. Let's begin with Alex Lubin. Alex is professor of African American Studies and History at Pennsylvania State University. He's the author of Romance and Rights, The Politics of Interracial Intimacy, 1945 to 1956, Geographies of Liberation, The Making of an Afro-Arab Political Imaginary, and, most relevant for today, Never-Ending War on Terror. He's also been an editor or a co-editor of many other books. He's currently working on a history of the Afro-Asian Peoples Solidarity Organization, which was called the People's Bandung. He's also especially interested in Black American cultural production in Cairo, Egypt, during this era. This project explores the many ways that African American music, visual art, and poetry were transformed by and were transformative of Cairo's Third World Afro-Arab politics. Next up is Carly Krakow. Carly is a writer, journalist, faculty member at New York University's Gallatin School. She is also scholar in residence at NYU's School of Law's Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. She's completing her PhD in international law at the London School of Economics as a Judge Higgins Scholar and Modern Law Review Scholar. Her writing has appeared in a number of publications, including Al Jazeera, Opinio Juris, Open Democracy, and International Relations, among others. Last but far not least is Osamah Khalil, who is Associate Professor of History and Chair of the Undergraduate International Relations Program at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He is the author of America's Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise and the Rise of the National Security State. He's also the editor of United States Relations with China and Iran, Toward the Asian Century. His forthcoming book examines the relationship between domestic politics and U.S. foreign relations from John F. Kennedy to Joe Biden. So we kind of ended our last panel with thinking a lot about when this began. And of course, the United States has a long history of intervention or nation building, depending on the terms we want to use. And Iraq and the region in which it's embedded in has a long history of imperialism and imperial entanglements. So a classic historian's question is always, what about continuity? Is this continuity or is this change? And you can answer this in all sorts of ways. But how does what I might call the Second Iraq War fit into these broad chronologies? And in addition, where you begin a narrative is an argument. So where you're choosing to begin this narrative, I would also like you to reflect a bit on what that illustrates about the wider histories of these conflicts and also how we choose to tell those histories. Why don't you begin, Alex?
Okay. First of all, I want to thank the Mershon Center for organizing this, and especially to Zainab Qadri for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here. As you mentioned, it is always the historian's question, when does this begin? When does change happen? When do we commemorate a beginning and an ending? When do we think about an epochal change? When do we talk about continuity? And of course, I don't think that there's like one correct answer for doing that. But I would suggest, or at least in my thinking about the Iraq War and the War on Terror more generally, I think about the transformation that happened in US geopolitics, I'm an Americanist primarily, at the end of the Cold War, when there were possibilities for multinational collaborative futures, mixed economies within states, and the United States enforced a kind of unipolarity over the globe, and privileged capitalist economies. And so if I could, just to sort of read some of the historical context, the framings that I think are necessary to understanding the Iraq War. So if anything, what I'm talking about here is something of a prehistory, though we could, I guess, begin with Indian wars and frontier wars long ago. But so 1989, of course, the Cold War ends. I'm just going to read some dates here as a historian. 1991 is the fall of the Soviet Union, and the first Gulf War ensues in 1990, 1991. The hit film of that year is The Hunt for Red October, which sort of declares the victory of the West over the Soviet Union. From 1991 on, as Bridget and others pointed out in the previous panel, sort of endless sanctions and airstrikes against the Iraqi people. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama publishes The End of History, declaring the victory of liberal democracies over all other systems in the world, which I think is part of the making of American unipolarity. We also see in 1992 the Bosnian War and the Waco siege, which I think can be thought of in relation to this, and I'll explain why later. 1993, the hit films are True Lies, and the #1 television show is The X-Files, which is about government malfeasance and the lies that governments tell, as well as a general distrust of racial and racial others. It's more complex than that, of course. But we also see the World Trade Center bombings that year and US military intervention in Somalia. 1995, there is heightened concern in American popular culture with the loose nukes in the former Soviet territories, with one of the top 5 films of that year being Crimson Tide, about loose nukes in the Balkans. We also see then the Oklahoma City bombing that year and the judicial attempts to successfully prosecute those perpetrators. 1996, Samuel P. Huntington publishes The Clash of Civilizations, which one could argue is a transformation of the anti-communism of the Cold War to Islamophobia of the post-Cold War era. Of course, there's a lot of things happening building to that, including, and not least important, in 1997, the publication of the report of the Project for a New American Century, which determines that the Cold War's escalating militarization should endure in a sort of endless war, endless conflicts, and endless military readiness. In 1997, in that same year, the United States is militarily involved in Liberia, Sudan, Yugoslavia, Macedonia, if not other places. 2001, of course, is the attack on the World Trade Center, which for many policymakers and US historians marks a before and after, though I would suggest that that's not the correct marking point, that there was an earlier marking point. 2003, of course, is WMD and the distrust that comes from that. I don't think that 2003's WMD is unique in history. We only need to look at the Gulf of Tonkin lies or secrecy to think about government lies and war. The difference being, of course, that there were the War Powers Act passed after the Vietnam War lies, whereas after 2003, there was very little response. And then the other sort of context that I just want to raise for now, before we get into a deeper discussion, is that since 1989, 11 countries joined NATO, most of whom were post-Soviet or Warsaw Pact countries. And so we've seen a sort of escalation of NATO into former Soviet spheres of influence. So in sum, in this period from 1989, we see attacks on post-Cold War mixed economies and attacks on multinationalist possibilities, the propping up of authoritarian leaders who would privatize economies, not just in Iraq, but also in Russia and Central Europe, and the enforcement of liberalized economies and deregulation, similar to what the United States imposed on Latin America during an earlier period. So those are historical contexts. I think the strategy then, or the tactic, the challenge is to think about what is a narrative that can knit those together. But I want to pause now to leave time for my panelists, co-panelists.
Carly?
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Okay, great. I also want to thank Zainab and everyone at the Mershon Center for this invitation. We had a great first panel and very delighted to be here. And thank you to Lydia, our facilitator, and honored to be here with Osamah and Alex, whose work I admire very much. I was joking yesterday that I have a confession with regards to this panel. I'm not a historian. I think I'm the only one who isn't technically. I am a scholar of international law and environmental justice, so looking forward to weaving that into my analysis throughout this panel. I think I'll begin with some responses and reflections building on what Alex shared to this question of continuity. And I want to note that the U.S.-led invasion, as many of us, I think have commented in this vein, was not unique in the sense that it was in many ways symptomatic of a deeply problematic and damaging neocolonial mentality and project. And if we look at Vietnam, which I'll speak a little bit more about later, both in terms of the war and the aftermath, many of the parallels are quite harrowing. There are too many examples in addition to that to name, but as well, if we look historically at the horrific mistreatment of the indigenous population, of course, of the United States, and at the mistreatment ongoing of minority communities domestically in this country, the structures and manifestations are, of course, distinct, but the pattern is very much there. Specifically, though, with Vietnam, the pattern of first ignoring and then denying veterans' illnesses and suffering following exposure to Agent Orange, dioxin, during that war, and then ignoring and denying later the devastating effect this had on civilians. This is the same pattern that we're seeing in Iraq regarding birth anomalies, known as birth defects, being ignored by the U.S. government. So just a little bit of context on that. In Vietnam, children are still being born, which many of you may know, with fatal or life-altering conditions from a war that technically ended nearly 50 years ago. And we can continue that first panel's commentary on the idea of the war, of course, not having actually ended. Now, just in August 2022, we had the PACT Act passage, which is a long overdue, extremely necessary provision that provides access to health care and compensation for roughly 3.5 million U.S. veterans who have suffered greatly from exposure to burn pits. And the key aspect of this that I want to focus on is benefits for presumptive conditions, which removes the burden of proof for veterans. And what this means is that if their date of service and their location of service is covered, and the coverage is pretty extensive, addressing many sites in addition to Iraq and Afghanistan, where people were deployed worldwide as part of both the 1991 Gulf War and then the so-called global war on terror, then veterans should be covered. And this, I think, is right and just and needed because it is very, very difficult and often impossible to retrospectively pinpoint the exact source or moment of somebody's toxic exposure that causes their cancer or other, often fatal, illnesses years later, even if all the evidence is overwhelmingly there to indicate that link. But we need the same thing for Iraqis and for all civilians subjected to what I call in my work toxic saturation. Can say more about that later, but the idea being that this framework we commonly use of toxic exposure is really not sufficient to account for not mere exposure, but ceaselessly being steeped in toxins for years with no escape whatsoever. So hearing President Biden's press conference about the PACT Act, which he has then emphasized again in his State of the Union address most recently, it was emotionally devastating. They had the young child there of the veteran for whom the act was named. Biden speaks repeatedly about his son Beau's fatal brain cancer that he links directly to burn pit exposure. But it was also eerie, like something from science fiction, because we have two populations exposed, one long-term Iraqis and one comparatively more short-term with veterans. And one group, vets, are being rightfully acknowledged after a very long struggle, and it's not done. But the other Iraqis aren't even being denied, they're just being ignored. So they're being treated as though they don't exist. And I can say more about that later, but just last for now, I think the historical context and structure are obviously different, but just another point of reference, we can also think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors and how 70 years later, the long-term illness and death toll from radiation-linked cancer continues to rise. So I'll say more about these ideas of the categories of slow and fast violence and events, and how when there isn't that singular event, it changes our framing and often negates the realities of civilians. Thanks.
Osamah.
Great. Well, thank you. I also want to thank Zainab for organizing and the Mershon Center for hosting, and also Lydia, thank you for moderating. Thank my co-panelists, both great scholars, and I also want to take a particular moment to thank Alex for all of his support. He's been a great example as a senior scholar, especially for me when I was a junior scholar, and his encouragement, and Carly for her activism and her great work. I also want to thank the morning panel. When I was preparing for this over the past month, I felt like I was locked in a 2002 echo chamber. I'll talk more about that later, but it was kind of depressing and refreshing to hear the correction from this morning. So I think as a historian, the way I would answer that question is we could focus specifically on the United States and the Middle East, or United States and Iraq. And I think one way to think about that, to pick up on Carly's point about Vietnam, is the same way we talk about to our students about Vietnam as a successive story across administrations. We could think the same way about the Middle East and particularly about Iraq. So we can date this. We could start with Eisenhower, right? We could probably go back to Wilson and the failure of Wilsonian idealism, if we want to even reuse that term. But the creation of the creation of the Iraqi state, right? As I'll point out to my students, take a look at Iraq's borders and what should stand out at you about them. God does not draw in straight lines, but Winston Churchill does, right? So that tells us something about the creation of Iraq, the imposition of a Hashemite monarchy. And then by the time we get to the Eisenhower administration, we can start to get into kind of teasing apart the way the last panel ended, right? Because where does the Ba'ath Party come from? How do they come to power? Well, it should surprise nobody, right? That the United States supported one and likely two coups to bring the Ba'ath Party to power because they were afraid of the far more radical, as they viewed it, and friendly to communist regime led by Abdul Karim Qasim. So, with that, by the late 60s, we have Saddam Hussein as the vice president, who then helps consolidate power over the next decade. And one of the ways he does that, we heard about this in the first panel, was through the support of Kurdish uprisings backed by Tehran, the United States, and Israel. Of course, they were abandoned, but one of the things that uprising does is it helps to actually consolidate Saddam's regime and collapse the regime of the Shah. So, by 1979, the Iranian Revolution offers Saddam Hussein, who had been previously tilting towards Moscow, right? This is one of the reasons why the Kurdish uprising comes about. The Shah goes to Nixon, we actually have the meeting minutes, and talks about not only does he want to be the regional policeman, but that he can help with this problematic neighbor next door, right? And Kissinger, of course, writes about this, that what was the goal of the Kurdish uprising? And the goal of the Kurdish uprising was to moderate behavior in Baghdad. And that in the past, these uprisings had helped to moderate that behavior by changing the regimes in Baghdad. So there's a long history here of covert or overt operations. And as I'll talk about in a minute, there's a long history that, Iraq is not exceptional, right? Mm-hmm. So what the Iranian Revolution then offers is Saddam Hussein a chance now to show both the United States, Moscow, as well as regional Arab capitals, I can help you with our new problem next door. And we now know, to use John Gaddis's great phrase, we now know that a green light was sent from Washington through Riyadh to Baghdad to invade. All right? So, now, of course, the Carter administration will deny this all the livelong day. Nobody ever wants to own up to this. But Al Haig found it out. Thanks, Al. So, the ensuing Iran-Iraq war was devastating for both sides, not least of which because the United States sold weapons to both sides, with the goal of bleeding them both white. So, what it instead did was allow both governments in Tehran and in Baghdad to consolidate power. Right? The Iranian Revolution and Khomeini was saved, and they became actually much stronger by the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And Saddam Hussein's internal security regime became far more brutal and entrenched at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. So 10 months before Saddam invades Kuwait, right, the George Herbert Walker administration, Bush administration rather, sought to establish and has a national security policy. We want to establish, quote unquote, normal relations with Iraq. And that includes, and this will sound familiar, a greater role for U.S. firms in reconstruction, as well as political and economic incentives, as long as there are more moderate policies in Baghdad. And this is where Saddam fails, right? He has other ideas. But when we think about how we get to 2003, and we'll come back to this, I think, when we talk about the 90s, which are an interesting period. Because, of course, as we've already known, Kuwait is liberated, but Saddam stays in power. And Iraq is put under not just no-fly zones, but a heavy sanctions regime. And, of course, the U.S. embarks on efforts to overthrow him again and again and again. And so here we can see similarities, right? Syria in the 40s and 50s, Cuba in the 60s, Chile in the 60s and 70s. So, and again, we've all know, especially the historians in the room, the demonization of Castro. The Syrian governments were never really known well enough to be demonized, but they are now. And of course, Allende was demonized within the framework of the Nixon administration in Chile. So, in short, we can talk about that Saddam was a brutal dictator. He was. There's no denying it, right? But that's not why he was overthrown. His brutality served a real purpose at one point, until it no longer did. And we can come back to why. But we can also see the logic of empire, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but globally. So I'll leave it there. We'll come back.
Thanks a lot. So as a follow-up, Alex, you begin with the end of the Cold War. Carly, my sense was you're really drawn to this Vietnam comparison at both the regionally in Southeast Asia and then domestically in the United States. And Osamah, you're drawing upon these Cold War scripts globally, but also specifically to the Middle East. So I wonder to think a bit more sharply about what it means to start the narrative there.
Go ahead, Osamah.
Well, I think when we think about the narrative, and again, I did a lot on the Cold War, but again, we can talk about America's engagement with this area we call the Middle East and how the Middle East is defined and when it's defined, right, and what purpose that serves. And so again, we can start with Wilson, or we can go back to much earlier interactions. But I think for when we think about these frameworks and these definitions, there's also a point where they do serve a certain need, right? So we know how Saddam comes to power. We know who supports him. There's also a lot of agency there. It's also complicated to what we heard in the first panel about who is backing the regime, who is not, and how that can change based on certain whims. But I think also it's important for us, and I think this kind of picks up on something that was said in the first panel, for us to understand kind of also what's going on in the 1990s after the first Gulf War, and to Alex's point, that helps set in motion by the time we get to 9/11, where were we, right? So it's a way for me to kind of change the question a bit, if you don't mind, which is this. So Alex had already brought up the Project for a New American Century. So for those of you who don't know, it's this neoconservative outfit, which basically comprises almost all the members of what becomes the Bush administration, right, after the 2000 election. And so, of course, one of their key things is to put pressure on a very weak Clinton administration to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And so we have this open letter signed by Rumsfeld, by Cheney, by others, and they're active in Congress. And so let's remember, it's the 1990s, right? And it's 1997, 1998, in which we have a scandal-racked presidency, right? And the same time this is happening, we have cracks in the sanctions regime. Dennis Halliday, the UN Assistant Secretary General, resigned, as did other officials, and likened the sanctions regime to genocide. To genocide. Now, by early February 98, as this is unfolding, the Clinton administration decides that they actually want to face Saddam. And there's a lot of accusations as to why now. Why are you doing this? Is it about the sanctions regime cracking? Is it about your own scandals? Right? The problem Washington has is that the allies don't necessarily agree. And they are beginning to question the sanctions regime, particularly after all this criticism. Of course, there's differences in what do you do with them, because there are those Democrats, much like we heard at the end of the first Gulf War, right, who don't necessarily want to replace Saddam with a democracy. What they would prefer is that another general just remove Saddam. And then it's a win for everybody, right? We still have our strong man. He can keep this state together. It'll satisfy our Arab allies, right? Neoconservatives, however, have another vision. And they're not shy about sharing this vision. It's in the open letter. Basically, we have a legislation that will be crafted and a war that will be crafted by the American Enterprise Institute, all right? So we actually get manufactured consent in the Congress with something called the Iraq Liberation Act. All right? So 1998, and I wonder how many remembered. I wonder how many remembered at the time, because it gets passed overwhelmingly in the House and Senate in the middle of the summer of 1998, when most Americans are paying attention to it, in the middle of the Clinton scandal. Right? Clinton is actually the first sitting president to testify before a grand jury when this is passed, and then he signs it. And he's facing impeachment. Now remember, it's 1998. There's a midterm election just a few months away. We've just passed an act in which, and the president has signed it, in which he authorizes the support for the overthrow of a foreign government. Right? Yet this is not an issue at all in the midterm elections. Not at all. Never comes up. So instead, the U.S. will continue funding opposition groups that have no support internally but have a ton of support inside the Washington Beltway. All right? That's where their home is, right? The Iraqi National Congress is basically two guys sitting around a fax machine in London, and then they have a bunch of offices in neocon think tanks in Washington. And of course, how does the year end? Almost the way it began, with this kind of 4-day bombing campaign with this fancy name, Operation Desert Fox. Saddam remains in power. But there's no full-scale invasion planned. We go into 99. We go into a 2000 election. And in 2000, Iraq is barely discussed at all. It doesn't even rank among issues in polling. So there's this belief I think some have, and I'll come back to this kind of when we talk about the narratives, about how much of this is continuity, how much of this is agreement or consensus among elite policymakers, how much did the American public agree? Was the American public even paying attention to Iraq? And how much of this was manufactured? And what I'm going to argue is that by the time we get to, and I can come back to it, so for example, by 1999, as I mentioned, this is crafted at AEI. If you've never heard of him, David Wormser publishes a book in 1999. He is AEI's Director of Middle East Studies. And he publishes a book called Tyranny's Ally, in which he offers this great vision for reshaping the Middle East, making America's allies in the region safe, making the United States safe, and of course restoring a Hashemite democracy, a Hashemite monarchy to Iraq, which means we're not talking about democracy anymore. We're just going to bring the Hashemites back. We're going to throw them in there. And so he will later become Cheney's Middle East advisor, for Vice President Cheney. So this agenda was one that the neocons were very clear about. It was one most Americans had no idea about, didn't share it, didn't know that it existed, unless you were inside Washington policy circles. But it's one that they're going to be sold. It's not one that U.S. allies agree with either, and I'll come back to it, but it's one they're going to be sold. So it's a way for me to kind of turn. So prior to September 11th, I would argue, had George Bush not been installed by the Supreme Court, it's unlikely there would have been a massive invasion of Iraq. There certainly wasn't domestic support for it, so that domestic support was ginned up through a massive and deliberate deception campaign, which I'll come back and talk about. I'll turn it over.
Go ahead.
Also,
Thanks.
sorry, Carly, if you can also talk a bit about your concepts of slow and fast violence, that would be excellent.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I think just to start these questions of, we've talked about the war not being over, but where does it begin? Origin points are obviously so important and interesting as well. I mean, another one to point out is, you could go in so many directions with this, but international law is an origin point following World War II. The idea of dignity being extremely prominent in pretty much every piece of international law that we refer to today, coming in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and dignity being front and center there. But what idea of dignity is there when we have such different responses to different groups being affected by these various forms of injustice? So that's one thing I think about with this idea of origin. But building on what Osamah shared about narrative and the story of the war, this has, of course, been central from the initiation. And I think, again, building on this morning's panel, a shift is needed away from this U.S.-centric narrative crafting that has dominated pre-war, war, and so-called post-war, and we can continue to discuss and reflect on that, but towards an continually increased focus on the irreparable civilian costs. So just to emphasize, and I'm kind of pivoting maybe to later reflections on the idea of lessons, but it's not acceptable to deem war zones abroad and marginalized communities domestically as experimental zones for new and experimental forms of weaponry and for novel tactics of repression. And, I think that is part of what we've seen with the war toxins and burn pits and this idea of slow and fast violence. And, slow violence, I think, is really useful for framing the fact that the effects of these toxins will not go away. They don't leave the party just because the U.S. has declared mission accomplished or has declared that actually this doesn't serve our interests anymore. They stick around, but the U.S. is, of course, infamously adept at evading what various governments, both Democratic and Republican, has seen as the confines of international law. And I think there's room for advocates and resistors of war and environmental injustice to continue to question what can international law offer, building on commitments in conventions like the Environmental Modification Convention or the Geneva Conventions that are neglected. So what is the strategic utility of international law as a flawed enterprise in light of its inability to actually prevent large-scale devastation, as we've seen in Iraq and so many other examples? So basically, how can it serve as one mechanism, one tool of many to ideally initiate enforceable demands for reparations and compensation for people who have lost their family members and for people who are now funding lifetime care for their children who have been sickened? Again, like the Geneva Conventions, other examples I could go on, but where enforceability is not feasible, how can international law at the very least be deployed to create pressure and to combat the tools of media manipulation, going back to this question of narrative and military might and the narrative surrounding that invading powers continue to use on vulnerable communities. I could say more, but just to end for now, I guess I have a piece out in this month's issue of the Progressive magazine, which I called Mission Not Accomplished, for Iraqis exposed to war toxins. And among other things in that, I quote from Sinan Antoun's novel, The Book of Collateral Damage, and he has some wonderful discussion in that book on depleted uranium and other toxins, where he very poetically describes how the remnants are left behind, and he describes it as depleted uranium munitions lie in the sands of Iraq like a soldier lost in enemy territory. But a soldier that won't die or be captured, it will keep breathing. What it exhales will settle in a lung or a womb. So I think that's one powerful way to illuminate the longevity and interminability of these toxins. Some more later.
Yeah, so I'll start my thoughts about this with a bit of a disclaimer, which is that I'm also, like Carly, not officially an historian, in the sense that although my affiliation at work is in a history department as well as African American studies, my training is in cultural studies, as in an American studies. And in that regard, my interests are not just in the sort of pre and post histories of events like 2003, but also in how interest is made. How does it become possible that certain aspects of warfare, its costs, become normalized? I just want to mention an anecdote. In 2003, I was part of a delegation. I was actually helping to lead the delegation of Americans interested in learning more about Palestine. And we were in the West Bank refugee camp of Jenin when a voice came down the street yelling, "Alex, Alex," yelling my name. I didn't know anybody in Jenin except our hosts. And it was a young guy I had gone to high school with who was serving in the US military. And his battalion, his group, was in Jenin training with Israelis on how to do house-to-house combat en route to Iraq. And it sort of opened up a moment to think about how certain forms of militarization travel across different geopolitical areas. And that opened up for me a discussion or thinking about militarized policing in the United States as one of the not even just legacies, but one of the organized plans of war on terror, violence abroad. So in my thinking about Iraq, my interest has been about how certain things have become normalized, how they become interesting to Americans. How is it that forms of surveillance, redefined notions of surveillance have become permissible in the United States? You know, as I ask my students, I teach a war on terror class, or I have for a long time. When I ask my students if they're fine with certain forms of surveillance on their telephones, their cell phones, most of my students initially at the beginning of class say they're fine with it because they have nothing to hide. And then as we were joking last night, when they send inappropriate photos, they don't want the government looking at those. This is a John Oliver skit, a famous one, by the way. But in the sense, they have adopted the idea that Fourth Amendment protections on privacy are far less important than other amendments to the Constitution. I've been thinking about how certain cities like Ferguson, Missouri, have replaced the disinvestment in industrial manufacturing with military hardware manufacturing. So Raytheon, for example, grew tremendously since 2003 in Ferguson, Missouri, bolstering, or around Ferguson, Missouri, and St. Louis, bolstering an economy that had been gutted during deindustrialization. How has the expenditures on militarization since 2003, since 2001, helped replace an otherwise deindustrializing economy? How has it become normalized that forms of executive power, the imperial presidency, have become so common and expected? And where does the distrust of authority and government surveillance or government powers come from? How did notions of torture in places like Abu Ghraib become acceptable? Sure, there's protest to it, but Guantanamo is not shut, right? Even though that became a talking point. And even though the Obama administration claimed that torture was anathema to US policy and values, we know that forms of drone extrajudicial violence and murder have endured. How has military policing and militarization abroad in places like Iraq come back to the United States? In preparation for this conference, I looked up the US military hardware used in Iraq that's come back to the United States. And one of them is an MRAV vehicle that came to Ohio State University. So an armored vehicle is on this campus, and Ohio State's not exceptional now. The Ohio State, excuse me, is not exceptional in that regard. The LA Unified School District has armored tank vehicles that were used in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. So in thinking about how those interests are made, how it is that violence and wars on terror become normalized, you know, I have to think not only about the sort of past and thinking about how prior to 2003, distrust was sown by events like Vietnam, but also I have to think about how certain practices after 2003 normalized a sort of war on terror mentality that my students, my children are in their 20s, so they're not really children anymore, but how they continue to sort of affect every aspect of their lives and just is something that they are used to, from TikTok interventions to other social media that has just infiltrated everything about their realities. So that is also, I think, part of war on terror policing. And then just very quickly, lastly, on militarized policing, I mentioned Ferguson as an important site because Ferguson's also a place where the Black Lives Matter movement was born, and the extrajudicial state violence of policing in Ferguson, Missouri was also part of a sort of war on terror training that police forces domestically have received in places like Israel, Palestine, and in places through military service in Iraq.
Thank you. I really like how instead of tracing sort of clean arcs, you're forcing us to think in terms of webs and lots of lots of different connections across time, across technologies, across affiliations, and how this kind of violates the idea that there can be one narrative, or even that there should be one narrative. Continuing to think with time, let's think about then, 2003, and now, 2023. An aspect of the writing about 2003, especially within the Bush administration and the intelligence failures, I find striking is always, and here I'm thinking of Robert Jervis's book on intelligence failures and also Mel Leffler's recent book on Bush administration decision making, is it's almost as if the closer people were to the decision making, the less they knew about what was going on, and that the further people were from those decision making, the more sources of information they had. So I want us to think about sort of what you knew and when you knew it, and from what sorts of sources. And for us also to think a bit about the difference between public and privately available information, and why secret information often gets privileged as more correct or more knowledgeable, but especially within these broader webs of interconnection, there's a lot of people who knew quite a lot about what was going on in Iraq in 2003 who were not part of these decision-making processes and in some ways had much better information. Carly, do you want to begin?
Sure. I think I'm going to kind of build on that question in a particular direction and then interested to hear Alex and Osamah. But I think that in terms of knowledge and knowing, one continual shift that we need is regarding how the United States and more broadly military powers globally view civilian lives. I don't think it's sufficient to say, as often said, it's a step in the right direction, but we need to value civilian lives more, or we need more information out sooner to the public about civilian lives, because that still lets an unjust hierarchy stand. So in a way, we actually need a rejection of the longstanding status quo and a complete overhaul of the idea of civilian lives being acceptable as collateral damage, again, to take that phrase from Sinan and Toon's book. But the Costs of War Project does a great job with putting information out there. We heard from members of that project this morning. But a few specific things within that, we need to work towards a reality where it's not acceptable for things like depleted uranium weaponry to be used, and certainly not to be used not just with a possibility or a risk, but with certainty of civilian exposure. So to go back to Lydia's question, how do we get information about these issues out to the public, and how do we galvanize people to care? I mean, there was a very important study led by a scientist in collaboration with others. The lead scientist is named Mojgan Savabi-Esfahani, where she documented one particular military base and how proximity following 2003 up until, I think this was 2019 when it came out, she documented the link that there was an increased risk of illnesses, birth anomalies, et cetera, and really severe conditions. And she included photographs of some of the children who are featured in the study. And there's a whole debate, I guess, within that also to have about showing photographs like that. And often I think there's an impulse to not show the public. And certainly when I teach, grappling with do I show students something like this? And when I speak to Iraqi scholars and activists and scientists like Mojgan, they speak more about the obligation to look and to witness, and that people are living with this, and that we need to see it and experience it secondhand. But also building on that, again, riffing on war toxins, a reality where burn pits, literally toxic pits of waste set on fire using jet fuel, sometimes as big as football fields, as they've been reported to be, to give a sense of scale. We need a reality where that is not commonplace and acceptable. We can look at other examples, but this is true worldwide in the military-dominated society in which we live, with the most recently proposed annual budget of $842 billion US. But I also just want to emphasize again, returning to something I said earlier, that these patterns apply also to supposedly non-militarized contexts. in the U.S. where the government and other governments permit or encourage the production of sacrifice zones to further economic goals and to accrue political power. So we can think of ideas about what is local, what is local and what is global, and thinking of Iraq as being disconnected from places in the U.S. like Cancer Alley in the U.S. South, which some of you may know about, basically an entire region in Louisiana and other surrounding states where people just have wildly disproportionately high rates of cancer because of the presence of the petrochemical industry. So in my work, I think about how something like that, or even cases that might seem even more distant, like water access issues in Flint and Detroit, Michigan, and then the suffering we are seeing with health injustice in Iraq, how these cases are framed as local, and the public is kind of presented with a framing of, at best, oh, that is terrible, that is sad, but that's specific to that place. I don't, there's really not a pattern. What can we do? To the point where in the environmental justice sphere and in other human rights areas, local has become a pejorative term. It's local, it's dismissible. So in terms of knowing, knowledge, and the dissemination of information, I think that emphasis on these links across cases and across time is a really important part of that picture. My work actually began with a focus on Palestine, partly in class reading Geographies of Liberation, but certainly there as well we can think about toxic exposure in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Again, our first panel talked about Iraq being unlivable. Gaza was declared unlivable by the UN in 2020, and onwards we go. So what does it mean for places to be unlivable, and how do we, one, have this information which is available, which the facts are there, how do we have that out to the public, and then how do we have the raising of support, awareness, and activism in response? And I can say more, but I'll let Alex and Osamah intervene.
No, please.
So I'll make a pitch for my first book where I kind of answered this question that you had. So, and again, it takes us back to Vietnam, right? So, one of the reasons when I decided to write the first book was I abandoned a previous dissertation topic, and then in the middle of it, for whatever reason. So, in part because of the Iraq War, and because of the narrative I had been hearing for several years, which we'll come back to, which still exists, and it actually comes back to the first panel about which memory are we talking about. So, one of the questions I was interested in is, how did Middle East studies emerge in the United States? What were its connections back to Europe? What were its alignments with the state, and how did it diverge? And so it brings us to the Vietnam era. After kind of, really unpacking that, Middle East studies, like many of the other studies, area studies in the United States, were closely aligned with the state in the initial Cold War period, and funded by the state or state agencies, as well as foundations that were then tied to the state as well. But there's this rift that emerges in the Vietnam War, the emergence of the New Left movement, and kind of challenging of U.S. foreign policy goals, not just in Southeast Asia, but in the Middle East. And what we start to see, and I talk about in the book, is that by the late 70s, definitely by the 80s, the privileging of signals intelligence, top secret intelligence by the intelligence community and the government over academic knowledge, right? And what will also happen is we're not going to get rid of academic knowledge. We're going to go with particular academics that we want to deal with. So somebody like a Samuel Huntington, right? He's one of the key people. And over again. So a set group of scholars who think like us, who can work with us, we will rely on them. And what this also ties into, by the time we get to, so the same echo chamber that existed in Vietnam will then be replicated in policies through the 80s into the 90s, and then ultimately September 11th. And of course, drawing on a set group of scholars from universities, but also think tanks, because think tanks are going to produce the knowledge that we need with some kind of academic credentials. We won't have the issue of anti-American scholars in the academy, particularly in the Middle East, but also Latin America is another one that gets kind of thrown in. And so by the time we get to September 11th, right, after a decade of pure-on demonization of Saddam Hussein, who again, brutal dictator, not a nice guy, but there have been a decade of demonization, right? But also a decade or more, if not further back, a century of Islamophobia within, not just within American society, but also academia itself, right? Within government policy centers, another thing I track in that first book. And so by the time we get to 9/11, the ground is already laid, right? It's very easy to come now and talk about the need for reform in Islam, the need for a broader reform in Islam, but a reform also in the Middle East. It's very easy to kind of present these very low-cost invasions, right, using Bosnia, et cetera, as an example, or the first Gulf War as an example, right? But also that narrative that will come in, right? So if you think about kind of the days before, on September 10th, 2001, was the American public primed for another invasion of Iraq? Would they have supported another invasion of Iraq? It's easy to forget. George Bush does not win the popular vote, right? You have a Supreme Court. He's only 9 months into his presidency, right? And it's not like it was going great in the first 9 months either. And so America's allies are not on board with regime change, including the UK. So I think it's important to come back to that because I understand Professor Loeffler was here, and I've read his new book. And there's other books out there as well that say, by the time of 9/11, containment was failing. And this is why the Bush administration went in. Containment was not failing. The Bush administration knew it. London knew it. Paris knew it. Berlin knew it. Everybody knew it. In fact, we all know it now because Saddam Hussein's army collapsed, right, very quickly. Containment was not failing. The policy that was failing was regime change. That's the policy that was put on steroids. And that policy was sold then through, when we talk about what do we know and how do we know it, through, again, a deliberate policy deception. How do we know that? Well, thankfully, unlike in the United States, and this is, I think, one of the challenges with Professor Loeffler's book, we have several inquiries in the UK into their failures, right? And we have the actual minutes and the memos from Jack Straw telling the intelligence community in the UK, you need to make Iraq look exceptional. I don't want to hear that Libya is a bigger threat. I don't want to hear about North Korea, and I don't want to hear about Iran. The issue we're facing is Iraq. His words. You need to make it look exceptional. We need to tie our case to Washington. Right? So I actually want to come back a little bit when we talk about kind of the narratives in a second. But so I think, how do we know what we knew? And I think that's also one of the things we can think about 20 years later are the silences. I mean, that's what strikes me. We heard a little bit of that in the first panel, a lot of that in the first panel. There are other silences here. The biggest anti-war movement since the Vietnam War has been completely erased from history. Right? To make it worse, when I talk about that, many of us who protested against the war, and this was a global anti-war effort, were derided as supporters of Saddam, or worse, we were in league with bin Laden. We were going to make America weaker. We didn't know we were naive. Right? That's been erased. You rarely, if ever, hear about it anymore. So among the many, many silences, I think that's one. And at the same time, we were sold this, while we were being dismissed as naive, and those in the academy who were opposed to it. And so we could talk about the foreign policy scholars who pay for this ad in the New York Times, the realist scholars who are dismissed as naive or worse, the Middle East scholars who are dismissed as anti-American or worse, didn't know what they were talking about. And I'll come back to kind of the other narrative that's kicked in immediately after the war was clear to be a failure, right? So it was known. They were warned. It was known when you look at the debate over the authorization for military force, and I'll come back to this in a second. Senator Patrick Leahy on the Senate floor is warning. You haven't shown me the evidence. In fact, as he writes in his memoir, he was informed by members of the intelligence community, you need to request certain files. If you request certain files, you will see that the books are being cooked. And he did. And he references this on the Senate floor. He talks about it in his memoirs. But he also says, I'm going to warn about two things. There is no post-war planning, and there's no immediate threat. So I'll come back to that in a second. But so we knew. What we were told was, no. This needs to happen. And so that's another issue, I think, when we talk about Professor Loeffler's book and the role he plays. I'll come back to this in a bit, when he talks about fear, the role of fear.
I don't have that much to add to it. I think Osamah and Khalil summarized it very well. I think ultimately what this is about the geopolitics of knowledge production, right? And in that sense, we're not only thinking about media and governmental entities that that tell us about reality, but also, and I tried to gesture towards this in my opening remarks, the sort of films and television shows that help us make meaning about a particular moment. And I think that the ways in which the events of 9/11/2001 were deemed exceptional as unprecedented forms of violence, and the ways that the Bush administration successfully demarcated a before and after 9/11 opened the floodgates of exceptional forms of violence that were normalized. And of course, we never heard the knowledge or voices, we being mainstream U.S. public, of the sanction regimes and the violence of the sanction regimes before 2003. And not to mention anything of the histories of colonialism in that region.
But actually, I think it's worse than that. Because I'm sure you recall, I think many will recall in the room, the interview with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, where she was asked by Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes, you can still find the clip, right, in which she's asked about the sanctions regime and the claims of genocide and that 500,000 Iraqi children have died, and do we think it's worth it? And Madeleine Albright said, yes, we believe it's worth it. And so I think there's this, and so again, when we think about like that moment, that 1998 moment, right, and this claim that there, some of the claims that are out there about, that this indicated the United States really, had taken on this charge about Iraq, right? How much of this, and we can think about how much Iraq is invisible to Americans, how much 500,000 Iraqi, it's such a staggering number that number is likely invisible. And at the same time, that number's then inverted, right? When you think about it, to the point earlier, for those in the room who may remember, there were shifting rationales like a whack-a-mole, right? So it was WND. When that didn't work, it was the Freedom Agenda. When that didn't work, it was the humanitarian intervention. When that didn't work, it was, well, we already have the forces in the field, and summer's coming. If we don't send them, they're going to break, right? And so, anytime there was a counter to that argument. But I do think it's one of these questions of why are these lives invisible? And this is not just about Iraq, right? Look at Vietnam. Look at Vietnam in popular culture. So the classics of the great Hollywood films, The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now, right? You think about it. Who are the Vietnamese characters in those films? What speaking roles do they have? And this is not my argument. This is, right? We actually had, Spike Lee has one that he just did, focusing on the experience of black American soldiers in Vietnam. And again, not a single speaking role, not a single Vietnamese character, right? That persists into the second range. If you know this better than I do, right? Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, you name it, right? Remarkably, there might actually be one speaking role for an Amerasian character in Rambo 2. Like the worst of the bunch, and that actually has a character, right?
So,
I was going to make super briefly just another piece of this kind of timeline. The perpetual states of emergency post 9/11 that continued on, and just thinking about in terms of shifting the American public's, the U.S. public's gaze to the domestic threat, and obviously away from the civilian toll as another piece of that narrative.
yeah, this is really important. So right before we open it up, I'm going to ask you each very briefly to think of one sort of lesson learned. And I hate that framing because I feel this is what historians are always asked to do for policy audiences, and history doesn't work this way. And so it forces a kind of simplification, a kind of decontextualization that often leads to mediocre analysis. That said, we've spent a lot of time on how this is not unique. The U.S. is going to be engaged in future global military interventions. We've traced chronologies backwards, and we will continue to trace them forwards. So since this isn't over, to think briefly about one possible lesson learned.
So we haven't learned anything. we haven't learned anything from Vietnam. In fact, what we've done is we've repackaged failures and sold them as successes. We haven't learned anything from Iraq. We're still in Iraq. So February 2002, what year is it, 23? February 2023, the U.S. Central Command reported, as part of the Defeat ISIS mission in Iraq, that the U.S. continues to provide advice and support on 33 partnered operations with Iraqi and Kurdish forces against the Islamic State. We're still there. We're still in Syria, in fact. And so we haven't learned anything. If you look at the U.S. interventions, quote unquote, during the Arab Spring, Libya, sold as a humanitarian intervention. Sold to the public as a humanitarian intervention, in which President Barack Obama, later admitted, yeah, I made that up. It was about regime change. Sound familiar? Sold as a humanitarian intervention and was about regime change, with no planning for what to do after the regime was overthrown, in which you actually have slavery return in modern times. Right? We've learned nothing. We've supported Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia sold the war in Yemen as a 6-week war. Sound familiar? 8 years later, they're still fighting with active U.S. support. There's a very weak ceasefire in place. The Saudis want to find a way out. They can't find a way out. The United States is occupying a third of Syria. Today, a third of Syria. All right? We've learned nothing.
Thanks. Yeah, responding to the question, promising to avoid any mediocre analysis. I don't know that anyone who really needs to learn this lesson has learned it, following what Osamah just shared, but I've said it, it merits saying again, the U.S. does not have a right to invade other countries, and certainly not under false pretenses, based on false information that is manipulated to present to the public to galvanize them, us, to support an invasion and occupation. I think that's what most merits repeating, then getting into the minutia of the actual specifics of the damage that was caused, but not wanting to do that in order to emphasize that invasion is not acceptable in the first place. Following that, I think that the invasion and occupation of Iraq, as we have all covered, is not unique. It needs to be placed in historical context. There is an aspect of precedent setting in terms of normalizing war toxins and normalizing other forms of the abuse and neglect and abandonment of civilians. Significantly, Yemen, I think, is such an important example. I could go on and on. Palestine, domestically, the examples I shared. Now with Ukraine, we see the question coming up again with the invasion of Ukraine of depleted uranium weaponry and a return to that debate as it is framed when it should not be a debate at all. So I could say more, but I'll let Alex go and save it for some questions, hopefully.
Yeah, just very briefly, I'm not going to be as smart as my colleagues here, but just I think the talking heads are right. It's the same as it ever was. And, in that regard, this is a repeat of a kind of humanitarian rationale for military intervention that has large geopolitical and economic stakes for expanding U.S. power globally. At the same time, I do want to note that there are particularities to the Iraq situation. And, I think we heard that in the sort of environmental politics that are localized and not just always part of a sort of global politics or local histories that are really important. So while on the one hand, I think it's very easy for scholars like myself to fit the Iraq War into a larger narrative about imperial violence, I do want to respect and hear more of the sort of particularities about Iraq post-2003, which I think we did hear a lot in the first panel.
Audience. Yeah, great.
Thanks, everyone. That was really terrific. My question is actually to Osamah. I wonder, and maybe I misunderstood the way you put it, Osamah, which is that Iraq was Bush's war, it was the neocons' war. When, as you yourself mentioned, the Iraq Liberation Act was passed by the Clinton administration, and of course there were hawks and doves, and the hawks were very much for it. It was not just the Vulcans, as they're called, who pushed this in the open letter, but Madeleine Albright, Martin Indyk, and so on, were very much for regime change. I've been doing some research on the CFR crowd, right? and they are neocon, they are realists, they are, and they all seem to agree on much more than they disagree. And what I've seen is that the disagreement was around strategy, so as not to have blowback, right? Unilateralism versus multilateralism, and so forth. So what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that sanctions were not working to some extent, which is to say that the excess supply of oil, whereas it was quite plentiful in the early 90s, it had reached something like 2% by the late 90s. And in large part, that's because of because of the sanctions on Iraq. And of course, the sanctions were also incredibly unpopular with populations in Europe, right? Dennis Halliday, you mentioned, but Hans von Spanik, all of these people. I did part of a speaking tour of Dennis Halliday all around the US, and there was a good deal of sympathy for Iraqi people and opposition to the US. So, it was a bit complicated around all of those forces. And I raised this to you because as we think about the rehabilitation of Bush in the post-Trump era, there's also a way in which the disaster of Iraq means that the Democrats want to say, oh, we had nothing to do with this. This is all about the neocons. And I just don't know if I want to let them off the hook that easily. And finally, the last point is I do think that the ruling elite did draw one lesson from Iraq, and that is that boots on the ground, full-scale warfare doesn't work. And so the Obama administration decided that it's going to be drone warfare, it's going to be cyber warfare, it's going to be special operation forces, and so on. And I would be surprised to see another full-scale war in the near future. Now, of course, attention has shifted away to great power rivalry with Russia and China and proxy wars and supporting all of that. But yeah.
So I think let me answer that in 3 different ways. So one, yeah, absolutely, Democratic hawks were in favor of the war. That doesn't mean they're not neocons. Right. So when we think about what right, so we tend to think about the neocons a certain way. Remember, the neocons. One of the things I write about is how the neocons emerge out of the Democratic Party. What do they split about? They split with they split for Reagan basically in '80 over what? They lead the Dems essentially, right, over Vietnam and Israel. These are the two things: criticism over Israel, and that's why they need to leave the New Left and start to kind of become this kind of hardcore wing of the Democrats, and then go with Reagan in the '80s. So one of the great examples of the Democratic hawks is the New Republic, right? So Peter Beinart, Rich Lowry, et cetera. And one of the things they're going to do, they're going to have this edition in June 2004, a year after the war, and it's titled, Were We Wrong? Right? And guess what? They weren't, right? We weren't wrong. In fact, one of the things you will hear, and this gets back to the narrative that Alex talked about, so when you think about during the build-up to war, anti-war voices were left out of the media generally. After the war goes bad, who gets favored? It's not the anti-war voices, it's the voices who were in favor of the war, but now say the war went bad, right? And the prevailing narrative becomes, we were right to be wrong, but you the anti-war guys, you were wrong to be right, okay? And so here, here's the new Lowry. Were we wrong? No, we had strategic and moral reasons. And my favorite line is, we feel regret but no shame, right? And now it's up to Iraqis, right? Because now we have an easy way to, right? So now it's up to Iraqis. Okay, so I think one of the things when we get to the 20-year mark is this kind of gets back to the question about narrative, and maybe I'll come back to this in a separate question because I want to answer your other question. So yeah, when I talk about this as AEI's war, don't forget there's a huge number of AEI staffers who fold into the Bush administration. They've laid out this vision, but one of the things that Dems wanted was not necessarily a full-scale invasion. Again, they wanted a strong man, just not Saddam. A way to sell that. We got rid of Saddam. We got rid of the bad guy. We did what Bush couldn't do. Right, George Herbert Walker Bush, President Bush. 9/11 kind of gives them a chance here for these two streams to come together, right? So this war is sold in parts, not just sold by Republicans, it's sold by Democratic hawks and to Democratic hawks, right? Including, one of the examples I talk about is in the book is Kenneth Pollock, who's he's married to Andrea Koppel, who's Ted Koppel's daughter. So there's all these media connections to Kenneth Pollock, who's at the Brookings Saban Center, was in Clinton's National Security Council. So there's all kinds of linkages here when we talk about kind of the national security wing, the hardcore wing of the Democratic Party. I just want to say this about President Obama, and then I'll leave it to others. Don't forget, when we talk about lessons learned, So what won the war in Iraq? Because remember, there's a whole narrative here. We can go through the 1-year anniversary, the 5-year, all very similar narratives. By the 10-year anniversary, we won the war through the surge. We won it through the surge. And how do we know that? Because then Barack Obama took the surge and sent it to Afghanistan, where it also failed. When did we stop talking about the surge? A year later, when Mosul fell under ISIS. And then it turned out, although this is rarely reported, what let the surge to succeed? It wasn't the infusion of 15 to 20,000 troops. It was the power sharing agreement that collapsed. Right? There are other components to it as well that we could get into. But remember, that narrative about lessons learned, oh, the surge worked. The surge worked. In fact, Obama is challenged on the campaign trail by reporters. You were critical of the surge, but the surge worked. And he has to say, oh, yeah, the surge worked. Right? And that will be his policy. So I wish I shared your optimism about large-scale engagements. I don't. I wish I did. I hope I'm wrong.
Okay, thank you. You've bumped up against us in various ways, but I'd like to get it sort of clarified. George W. Bush came into office promising a humble foreign policy in the debates, and Al Gore said, yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And so my question is, what would have happened if 9/11 hadn't taken place? In other words, would there have been a war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, a GWAT, or a national security state? Now, to what degree was it crucial? And things would have been humble, by comparison at least. George Bush did promise to rid the world of evil, which is really not very humble, since God tried and failed with that flood of his some time ago to do it.
Yeah, I like counterfactuals. I don't really deal with them. I think you're right that, he did promise a more humble foreign policy. There are indications pre 9/11 that they were already focusing on Iraq. To Professor Kumar's point, that was regime change. Yeah, exactly. And that's also the difference with sanctions. So, when we talk about the sanctions regime cracking is different than regime change, right? So could you have tightened the sanctions regime without regime change? Yeah. Could you have tweaked it, right? So there were a number of things, there were a number of options on the table. And I think, again, when you look at the split among the U.S.'s allies, including the UK, so Blair was not in favor initially of regime change. So this takes us back, so if I can actually turn your thing to talk about Professor Loeffler's book. One of the things he's going to argue is that fear was paramount. It was paramount in London and it was paramount in Washington, but he doesn't talk at all about the fear mongering. He pitches that on Cheney, right? But let's remember, it's like the standard. Alex knows this because he deals with pop culture more than I do, right? There's the standard in police procedurals. You have a good cop, you have a bad cop, right? Cheney's the bad cop. But Bush wasn't necessarily the good cop because Bush had laid it out. Almost immediately after September 11th, he asked General Franks to begin to initiate war planning, right? And here's what we have from Rumsfeld. If you don't mind, if you can bear with me, I'll read it to you. So here's when we think about kind of what are some of the causes. Here is Rumsfeld's 2001, September 2001, Strategic Thoughts memo. A key war aim would be to persuade or compel states to stop supporting terrorism. The regimes of such states should see that it will be fatal to host terrorists who attack the U.S. If the war does not significantly change the world's political map, the U.S. will not achieve its aims. There is value in being clear on the order of magnitude of the necessary change. The U.S. government should envision a goal along these lines: new regimes in Afghanistan and another key state or two that supports terrorism. That's September 2001. War planning was already underway by General Franks. That war planning is done by January 2002. Right? They're going to tweak it through spring of 2002. President Bush will deliver the outlines of the Bush Doctrine at West Point in June. We have the National Security Strategy that's released in... That's after 9/11. Yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of because I don't want to really deal with the counterfactual, right? We have some indications that they were looking at Iraq before that, but it's all based on Paul O'Neill. We don't have a ton before that. Paul O'Neill was Secretary of Treasury, and he basically gets fired, and that's in his memoir that they were talking about Iraq, but it wasn't clear. But one of the problems is we have this narrative that's being pushed that President Bush was deliberate. He went to war as a last resort. As a last resort, we're told. Well, that's obviously not true, because if it was a last resort, they would have continued working with the UN. If he was really interested in diplomacy, he would have continued working with the UN. Instead, what we were told is we're going to steadily build up forces in the Gulf, and then we have to use them because summer's coming. Right? That is a really flawed logic for a historian to make. It's a really flawed logic when you're looking at the UK inquiries and you're using that as one of your sources and then completely splitting with their findings without explaining why you're splitting with their findings, including that Tony Blair, what drove Tony Blair was not fear of Saddam Hussein, it was fear of not being George Bush's good friend and the UK being the indispensable ally. So, again, I don't really deal with counterfactuals in my work. I'd love to. It's sometimes far more interesting. I think what would be more important for us is for us to look at kind of, again, the question about lessons learned, but also how did we get here? How was this war sold? Why did we buy it hook, line, and sinker as a public? Why did the public, so think, right.
So,
Well, can I just, real
do
quick,
the other panelists want to weigh in on this at all?
can I just make one
Sorry.
quick point? I don't want to dominate, but let me just say this. By a year into 9/11, the Pew Research finds, right, that most Americans accept that Al-Qaeda was tied to Saddam Hussein, that he had something to do with 9/11. And for those who are academics in the room, ask your students today, why did the United States invade Iraq? And they will tell you because Iraq had something to do with 9/11, because nothing else makes sense to them, right? So the deception has become accepted as fact, right? The deception has become accepted as fact. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate. But.
Yeah, I don't have a clear answer to a hypothetical, but one possible reading of the present is that 9/11 was a sort of useful moment for a framing of a global world order, for sure. But that 9/11, the war on terror, I should say, the global war on terror, Iraq, are symptomatic of an attempt to remake a world order following the Cold War in the image of American global power. And in that regard, how the chips would have fallen, right, may look different depending on whether it's organized around 9/11 or not. But the rhetoric of the indispensability of US geopolitical power, the disorder and potential threat of the Muslim world in the Clash of Civilization thesis, that groundwork had already been laid. So it might have been other conflicts that would have played out, but surely they would have played out not in Europe, not in the United States, but in the Middle East and in Asia. So, that's how I think about that. What if something else had happened, we can't answer. But I do think that we ought to sort of think in the sort of longer term about how, in my view, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, transformed American power in profound ways.
I think it's been covered, but just to say, again, I don't know about the particular hypothetical, but the global war on terror, as it is called, led to the increase in production of terrorism. So in terms of the particular moment, that's one thing, but in terms of violence and this so-called world order being perpetuated and escalated in different forms, the result has been more violence. But I think we have more questions, so I'll leave it there.
Thanks for a great panel. I'm interested in the difference between sort of the lessons learned from Vietnam versus Iraq, and someone used the phrase earlier, the sort of normalization of George W., or the resurrection of George W. Bush. And it seems like, so I grew up in the post-Vietnam era, and it seemed like the lessons from Vietnam were that it was kind of a big mistake. We shouldn't do something like that again. The Pentagon's kind of bungling, inefficient, and soldiers on the ground weren't supported, and it was kind of hopeless. And then with Iraq, it's all been very kind of even-handed and almost cleansed in this 20th anniversary, which I thought would be kind of it's had kind of the opposite effect on me, because I've been sort of dismayed at most of the conversations about the Iraq War. So my sort of hypothesis about why the lessons from Iraq have been so much different is maybe because those wars were so long that we still had, like Americans still had fellow Americans off fighting in those wars. And and that it was just harder to criticize a war that was still ongoing. So you had years of sort of not really confronting it. And then the normalization, just the fact that we were on a war footing for so long. You had friends going to war, you had people walking around campus in fatigues, you had MRAPs on college campuses. It was almost like war just became normal. Anyway, I'm just interested in your thoughts about why the reactions or lessons from Vietnam seem to be different from Iraq. Thanks.
Yeah, and Carly, why don't you lead off since you began with the Vietnam comparison?
Sure. Thanks for bringing up the question and this topic again. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is there was a piece in the New York Times a few years ago, I think, Viet Thanh Nguyen, the Vietnamese American author, and Richard Hughes, and they wrote about shame. And I think, Osamah, you mentioned shame earlier. And they spoke about going to Vietnam and meeting some of what they call the forgotten victims that are still very much alive today. Again, people still being born with so-called deformities. And they talked about one woman who turned away. She didn't want to be photographed. And they said, you know, she had a hydrocephalic head, which is a very severe condition, swelling, and a lot of suffering, and that she didn't want to be photographed. And they said, well, maybe she doesn't want strangers to stare at her, which is understandable. Maybe she feels ashamed of her condition. But if she feels shame, then why do those who should feel no shame? So I don't know, that's kind of a question to your question, but I think a lot about how these kinds of questions lead to a reflexive response, which I think has good intentions of ultimately pushing victims of whether it's war toxins or war injuries or war violence more broadly to display their vulnerability and victimhood with the hope that it will shift the narrative. So with Iraq, there is a push to that of, well, if people know, if we put victims out front, then maybe it will raise awareness. I think that's dangerous, and that victims are often then made further, more vulnerable to no avail. In terms of the different structures, I could say more, but I'll let it go to the others and then maybe circle back.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it's important to note that the architects of the global war on terror were also those who had been involved in the debacles in Vietnam. And I think that many of them were quite conscious that they didn't want to reproduce the so-called failures of Vietnam, but they defined those failures as the sort of powers, the failure of Vietnam was due to the sort of regulatory authority of the Congress over the abilities of the president and the Department of Defense to wage warfare. So it was very much about a dismantling of things like the War Powers Act, and to redefine the terms of engagement so that it would sort of skirt some of the regulations that had been imposed by Vietnam. You know, someone who I read faithfully, and Dr. Quadri studied with, Melanie McAllister, writes about the Vietnam syndrome as something that very much sort of animates a sort of muscular American diplomacy following Vietnam that attaches to sort of trying to make sure that humiliation never happens again. And that's not just through making policy change, but also through rhetorical change that redefines the powers of the president to engage in warfare. I mean, the war on terror is also waged as a sort of redemptive war against sort of U.S. vulnerability and victimhood. So the United States, even though we are talking about Iraq and other conflicts as sort of interventions, you know, I think there's an aspect of the narrative of the war that it's very much a reaction to protecting the United States from its own vulnerability. And in that regard, it borrows from other forms of vulnerable empires that need to defend themselves from global disorder. That's not an answer to your question, but I think you're absolutely right that we need to think about that post-Vietnam moment as well.
But I think there's also, you know, it's contested because you could pick up a book, for example, by Max Boot that talks about how we could have won the war. You know, if only we had listened to General Lansdale, right? That's his argument. If we listened to Edward Lansdale, we could have won the war. So there's this whole other narrative about, to Alex's point, about how was the war lost? Who lost it? Was it the media? Was it those campus protesters? Right? How do we maintain public support? How do we maintain media support? It's one of the lessons, for example, like that comes back with, when we talk about lessons learned, that comes back when we get to Iraq. How do you maintain, right, that cohesion in society? And Rumsfeld is very involved in that in from 2001 into 2002 and 3. But as we're thinking about as historians, there's a whole other thread and narrative. And we talk about kind of how contentious some academic debates can be. Debate over the Vietnam War is still contentious 50 years later, right? And even this question about could it have been won? And so when you get when we're talking about Edward Lansdale, there's a premise there that he wasn't listened to. Jack Kennedy listened to him, right? They tried it. It didn't work. There's a reason it didn't work, right? So, I think it's the same thing we're going to see over the next 20 years with Iraq, to 40 years, 60 years, and the war on terror. Why was it lost, right? Was it lost? In fact, we're hearing the narrative in the 20-year anniversary, it wasn't lost, right? We didn't lose, right? Iraq today is a democracy. It's a troubled democracy, but it's a democracy, right? Saddam is gone. His sons are gone, right? The narrative that you brought up at your last conference, well, how many would Saddam have killed? That's the same narrative you heard in 2003, 2004. The same exact thing, right? So that is going to be a point of a contested point, I think, for historians. I had hoped it wouldn't be, but it's pretty clear it is. When we're still talking about that, Tony Blair was afraid, is pretty staggering.
And I was just going to add, I think the others have covered it, but the expert framing of the continued threat and this state of suspension that it produces going back to these ongoing states of emergency. So I think it keeps us forward-facing to the emerging threat that could come at any time and not backward-facing, which looking at Vietnam maybe should be where we precisely need to put our attention.
I think we should take a break for lunch. Thank you so much for this panel, this conversation about narratives, and this conversation about silences and what's made more and less visible our deliberate choices. A contrast with Vietnam and Iraq is how the wars were able to be covered. And I think that will really come to the forefront with our final panel after lunch. Thanks a lot.